You really think cheap noodles like these belong in a Michelin-starred restaurant? Nathan's voice echoed through the elegant French restaurant, his words dripping with humiliation. His wife, Elena, stood frozen. Would she shrink under his public attack, or would she fight back? What happened next shocked everyone in the room and changed her life forever. Want to hear a story about standing up for yourself? Stay tuned. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more inspiring stories. The chandeliers in La Lumière cast a golden glow over the perfectly set tables, reflecting off delicate crystal glasses and silverware polished to perfection. Soft, classical music floated through the air, blending seamlessly with the murmured conversations of San Francisco's elite. Everything about the evening was meticulously designed for an air of sophistication, until Nathan Collins decided to destroy it. With an exaggerated motion, he stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor, the sharp sound slicing through the restaurant's tranquil ambience. His face, already flushed from the wine, darkened further as he lifted a plastic food container, his fingers gripping it with barely concealed disdain. You really think cheap noodles like these belong in a Michelin-starred restaurant? The entire room fell silent. The clinking of forks and knives against porcelain plates ceased. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Eyes darted toward Table 9, where Nathan Collins, wealthy, polished, and well-connected, stood towering over his wife, Elena Cruz Collins. She remained seated, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the pristine white tablecloth. She had expected something like this. Not this exact scenario. She hadn't foreseen Nathan making a public spectacle out of her, but the humiliation, the condescending remarks, the sneering comments about her food, that she had long grown accustomed to. What she had never done before was fight back. Nathan's business associates exchanged uneasy glances, some of them shifting in their seats as if contemplating whether to intervene. One of them, Mark Halpern, a real estate mogul, let out a forced chuckle, probably hoping to turn the moment into a joke. "Nathan, come on now, it's just food." "No need to," Nathan ignored him. His focus was solely on Elena, his expression filled with a strange mixture of anger, frustration, and something else, insecurity. She saw it. She recognized it, but she didn't feel sorry for him. Not tonight. She slowly placed her napkin on the table and stood up. There was no hurry in her movements, no sign of the embarrassment Nathan was hoping to see. She met his gaze, dark eyes steady, her expression unreadable. For the first time that evening, Nathan faltered. His fingers tightened around the container in his hand as he realized, too late, that Elena wasn't going to react the way she always did. She wasn't going to shrink back, whisper an apology, or quietly endure his insults. The restaurant staff froze in place, unsure whether to step in or wait. A young waitress holding a tray of wine glasses stood rooted to the spot, her eyes wide. At the next table, an older couple sat watching, the woman shaking her head disapprovingly at Nathan's outburst while the man sighed, his expression weary. This wasn't just about dinner anymore. This was about power. And Elena could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, waiting, expecting her to fold. She took a breath. "Tell me, Nathan," she said, her voice calm but firm, carrying across the restaurant. "What exactly is so offensive about my food?" Nathan's jaw clenched. It's not about the food, Elena. It's about the setting. You don't bring." He gestured wildly at the container as though it personally insulted him. This kind of thing to a place like this." Elena tilted her head slightly, her expression cool. "A place like this?" "Yes," Nathan snapped, clearly aggravated that she wasn't playing her part, the submissive wife who would sit back down and let him reassert his dominance. "La Lumière is a Michelin-starred restaurant, Elena. People don't come here for," he waved a hand, "street food." Elena's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, but she didn't let the anger show. Street food. That was what he thought of it. the same food that had built her career from nothing, the same food that earned her clients ranging from doctors to lawyers to city officials. The same food that had paid for half the mortgage on their house, even while Nathan's business was failing. She could have thrown all of that back at him. Instead, she took a step forward. "Do you know what's funny, Nathan?" she asked, her voice conversational, as if they were merely discussing wine selections. "If my food is so beneath you, then why is it good enough for some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in this city?" A murmur rippled through the room. Nathan blinked. What are you talking about?" Alina smiled, a dangerous, knowing smile. "Just last month," she continued, her voice light, "the mayor's office requested my catering for their private event. Do you know what they specifically asked for?" She reached out and placed a hand on the container that Nathan still held in his grip. "This." The room was so silent you could hear the ice melting in glasses. Nathan stiffened. His fingers twitched around the container, his bravado starting to crack. The business associates at their table suddenly looked intrigued. Mark Halpern raised an eyebrow. "The mayor's office, that's impressive." One of the other men at the table, Henry Kaufman, a restaurant investor, frowned slightly. "Wait, Raina's Kitchen, that's you, isn't it?" Nathan's face went rigid. Alina's smile widened just slightly, because yes, Raina's Kitchen was hers. And not only was it hers, but it was also one of the fastest-growing catering businesses in the Bay Area. Nathan had spent months pretending not to notice. Tonight, he was out of options. A soft clinking sound came from the back of the restaurant as someone set their fork down. A waiter hesitated near the kitchen entrance, clearly debating whether he should intervene. But it wasn't necessary, because someone else stepped forward. A tall man, dressed in a chef's uniform with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held decades of culinary expertise. Chef Louis Bernard, the owner and executive chef of La Lumiere. The moment he appeared, a ripple of recognition passed through the room. He was a man whose opinion carried weight, a chef known for his relentless pursuit of perfection. His eyes landed on Alina first. Then they moved to Nathan. And then, finally, they settled on the container in Nathan's hand. Slowly, deliberately, he raised an eyebrow. "You're holding that like it's a bag of trash, Monsieur Collins," he said, his voice smooth but firm. Nathan swallowed. "Tell me," Chef Louis continued, ignoring Nathan entirely as he turned his full attention to Alina. "What dish did you bring?" Alina didn't hesitate. "Pancit." A small pause. Then, to everyone's shock, Chef Louis's face lit up. "Ah," he said, his tone filled with appreciation. "A classic. May I?" He held out his hands for the container, and just like that, power shifted. Nathan stood frozen, realizing too late that he was losing control of the situation. Because his wife, she wasn't the one who should be embarrassed, he was. And in that moment, Nathan Collins, successful businessman, proud entrepreneur, was about to learn the hard way that the quietest voices often carry the loudest truth. 3 months earlier, Alina's life had been far from the tense, suffocating moment in La Lumiere. Back then, she was in her element, thriving in ways she had never imagined when she first arrived in the U.S. Her days were long, exhausting, and messy in the best way possible. The smell of garlic sizzling in oil, the tang of freshly chopped calamansi, the comforting sound of bubbling broth. These were the rhythms of her world. Her business, Raina's Kitchen, had started in a cramped apartment kitchen in San Francisco, but had quickly expanded into a full-fledged catering service. What began as small neighborhood orders had grown into a business known across the city for its authentic Filipino cuisine. She still remembered the first time a major client called her directly. A law firm had reached out after an associate raved about her care, that rich, peanut buttery oxtail stew that took hours to prepare just right. They had requested a full spread for their corporate event: lumpia, pancit, adobo, lechon belly. The praise had been overwhelming. And it hadn't stopped there. Soon, Doctors, real estate agents, and even politicians were placing orders. Word spread fast in elite circles, and before long, Alina was delivering meals to some of the wealthiest clients in the city. Everyone recognized her talent, except her own husband. Nathan Collins had always been a man of appearances. Raised in an affluent family, he had spent his childhood eating at high-end steakhouses, vacationing in Europe, and learning that wealth was measured in status and sophistication. His father had been a real estate developer, his mother a socialite who planned charity galas but rarely attended them. He never understood food the way Alina did. For Nathan, fine dining meant exclusivity, plates with microscopic portions, menus with French words he could barely pronounce. It meant $500 wine pairings and waiters in white gloves. Alina's food. To him, it was street food. "This kind of food is fine for family gatherings, sure," he had once said casually, swirling his glass of bourbon, "but it doesn't belong in high-end places." Alina had laughed it off at the time, but the words had stayed with her. At first, Nathan's dismissiveness had been nothing more than an occasional comment, a side remark here and there. But then, his business started failing, and everything changed. Nathan was once one of the most promising real estate investors in San Francisco. At 42, he had built a reputation as a man who could flip properties into gold, but the market was changing. The pandemic had slowed down the luxury housing boom. Investors pulled back. Some of Nathan's biggest deals fell apart overnight. Slowly, his business began to crumble. And instead of facing it head-on, Nathan turned his frustration toward Alina. The shift had been subtle at first. It began with small things. The way he barely acknowledged her cooking anymore, how he stopped tasting new dishes she experimented with, how he came home with takeout bags instead of eating what she had prepared. Then, it escalated. "You're using your catering money for groceries again," Nathan had snapped one evening, slamming the refrigerator door harder than necessary. Alina had looked at him, confused. "Yes, I make money, Nathan, and I live here too. What's the problem?" Nathan had scoffed. He exhaled sharply. "It just doesn't feel right. I should be providing for us." Ah, there it was. It wasn't about the groceries. It was about the fact that she was doing better than him. Alina had sighed, closing the container of beef tapa she had been marinating. She didn't want to argue. She had told herself he was just stressed, that if his business picked up again, he'd stop acting like this. But deep down, she knew the truth. Nathan wasn't just angry at his failing business. He was angry that his wife was succeeding without him. Nathan had always enjoyed bragging about Alina's cooking, back when it wasn't a threat to his own success. In the early days of their marriage, he used to boast to friends about her meals, saying things like, "Man, my wife can cook better than half the restaurants in this city." But lately, he refused to even mention her business. One night, at a gathering with some of his colleagues, someone had casually asked, "Hey, Nathan, wasn't your wife's catering company featured in that foodie magazine last month?" Nathan had laughed a short, forced laugh. Yeah, she's having fun with that." Fun. That was how he saw it, not as a business, not as something she had built from nothing, not as real success, just a hobby. That night, as they drove home in silence, Alina had stared out the car window, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. And for the first time, she had thought, maybe he doesn't respect me at all. Every conversation with Nathan felt like walking on glass. One wrong word and it would shatter. She had held back so many times. She bit her tongue when he scoffed at her recipes. She forced a smile when he made offhand comments about how she was lucky to get clients. She pretended not to notice the resentment simmering in his eyes whenever someone praised her work. But something inside her had started to change. She loved Nathan, but she loved herself too. And for the first time in a long time, she was beginning to wonder, if he couldn't celebrate her success, did he even deserve to be part of it? 3 months ago, she would have never imagined standing in the middle of La Lumiere, publicly facing off against her husband. But looking back, maybe it had always been leading to this moment. Maybe Nathan had been testing how much of herself she was willing to sacrifice. And maybe, just maybe, tonight would be the night she finally refused to shrink for him anymore. The night had started with such hope. Alina had spent hours in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, her hands working with expert precision as she prepared her special pancit. Every strand of noodle had to be cooked perfectly, with just the right balance of soy sauce and calamansi juice. The shrimp, plump and fresh, were carefully sautéed until they gleamed. The vegetables were crisp, colorful, and sliced with care. This wasn't just food. This was a love letter, a tribute to her heritage, a reminder of who she was. And tonight, on their 5th wedding anniversary, she wanted Nathan to be proud of her. He used to be once. He used to rave about her cooking, used to tell everyone how lucky he was to have a wife who could cook like a professional chef. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Tonight, she wanted to remind him. She had packed the pancit in her best container, the one with the gold-trimmed edges, the one she used for her most prestigious clients. It wasn't just about bringing food. It was about sharing a part of herself with him, with his colleagues, with the people who mattered in his world. So when she arrived at La Lumiere, she felt hopeful. But hope didn't last long. The moment she sat down at table 9, she felt it. That subtle tension in the air. Nathan was already in his element, dressed in his most expensive suit, leaning back in his chair like he owned the room. His colleagues laughed at his jokes, glasses of wine in their hands, the scent of truffle butter and seared steak lingering in the air. She placed the container gently on the table. She saw it in his eyes immediately: disapproval, embarrassment, annoyance. A sinking feeling crept into her chest, but she forced herself to smile. "Nathan," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "I made something special for you, for us." He didn't take her hand. He barely looked at her. Instead, he exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he turned to his colleagues. And then, without warning, he stood up. Loudly. The chair scraped against the polished floor, the sound cutting through the hum of conversation like a blade. Every head in the restaurant turned toward them. Alina felt her stomach drop. And then he said it. "You really think cheap noodles like these belong in a Michelin-starred restaurant?" It was like a slap across the face. The air was sucked out of the room. The restaurant fell into absolute silence. Alina sat frozen, her hands resting on her lap, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She barely noticed the shocked expressions of the people around them. She barely registered the waitstaff stopping in their tracks, the soft gasp from someone at the next table. All she could focus on was Nathan's face, the disgust in his expression, the way he looked at her as if she had done something shameful. Nathan expected her to back down, to look away, to mumble an apology, to be humiliated and stay quiet like she always did, but not this time. Alina took a breath, and then she stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. She wasn't going to shrink herself for him anymore. Every single eye in La Lumiere was on her now. Nathan's smirk faltered. Alina didn't say a word. Instead, she reached forward, unsnapped the lid of the container and let it open with a soft click. The aroma hit the air immediately. Rich, savory garlic, the deep umami of soy sauce, the tang of calamansi, the warmth of fresh noodles. It was the smell of home, and the restaurant reacted before she even had to speak. "That smells amazing." Someone whispered, "What is that? It reminds me of my trip to Manila." "Oh wow, is that pancit?" Nathan's expression tightened. His eyes flickered across the room as he realized he was losing control of the situation. But before he could say anything, another voice rang out. "Madam Alina." The voice was rich, warm, carrying across the restaurant with authority. Alina turned her head, And there, walking toward them, was Chef Louis Bernard, the head chef of La Lumiere, the man who owned this entire restaurant, a man who commanded the respect of every single person in the room. He stepped forward, his sharp eyes scanning the scene, before landing on the open container of pancit on the table. And then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. "Ah," he said, nodding appreciatively. "I remember your food." Nathan stiffened. Chef Louis turned to the rest of the room, his voice carrying easily. "I had the pleasure of tasting Madame Alina's cooking at the mayor's event last month." A ripple of murmurs spread through the restaurant. "It was," he continued, lifting a hand dramatically, "spectacular." Silence. Then the mood of the room shifted. Diners leaned forward, intrigued. Waiters exchanged glances. Even Nathan's colleagues seemed curious now. Nathan's face drained of color. Chef Louis clapped his hands together once, the sound snapping through the air. "I have an idea," he announced. "Since Monsieur Collins has raised such a concern, let's settle this properly." He turned to the room. "Who here would like to taste Madame Alina's pancit?" A pause. Then a hand went up. Then another. Then three more. And before Nathan could stop it, the entire restaurant erupted into a chorus of agreement. Alina barely processed what was happening. Waiters began setting extra plates on the table. Customers turned in their seats, eager, excited. And Nathan stood frozen, realizing he had lost. Because in a matter of minutes, his attempt to humiliate his wife had backfired spectacularly. And he was about to learn, the hard way, what happens when you try to silence a woman who was never meant to be quiet. The energy in La Lumiere had completely changed. Only minutes ago, the restaurant had been a stage for Nathan Collins' humiliation attempt, a public forum where he had expected his wife to crumble under the weight of his words. Instead, the very people he had hoped to impress were now singing Alina's praises. The air was filled with the warm, savory scent of pancit, mingling with the restaurant's usual truffle-infused elegance. At every table, diners leaned forward, eager for a taste of the dish that had turned the evening upside down. Nathan, still standing, looked stunned, his face a shade paler than before. His business associates, once chuckling at his bravado, were now giving him side glances, their interest no longer on him but on the Filipina woman standing tall beside him. Alina, his wife, the woman he had spent years dismissing, and tonight she was about to leave him in the dust. Alina could feel the momentum shifting in her favor, but she hadn't spoken her final words yet. She cleared her throat, drawing all attention back to her. "Before we eat," she said, her voice carrying steadily across the room, "I'd like to share something with you all." Nathan visibly tensed, his fingers curling into fists. Alina took a slow breath, then reached into her purse. She pulled out a crisp white document, unfolding it carefully. The city's official seal gleamed at the top. "Last week," she said, her voice steady, "Reina's Kitchen was named the fastest-growing catering business in San Francisco." Murmurs spread instantly. Nathan's colleagues exchanged surprised glances. Some of them even nodded in approval. Alina's heart hammered, but she kept her expression composed. Nathan, meanwhile, looked completely blindsided. "That's impossible," he muttered under his breath. Alina turned her gaze to him. "Is it?" she asked. "Because while you were too busy underestimating me, Nathan, I was building something real." A quiet snicker came from the table. Alina didn't stop there. She reached back into her purse and pulled out a second document, a neatly folded letter, stamped with the golden emblem of the Golden Palace Hotel. "You might also be interested to know," she continued, unfolding the letter, "that I was offered the position of executive chef at Golden Palace's new Asian fusion restaurant." The reaction was immediate, a stunned silence, and then the Golden Palace. One of Nathan's associates blurted out, his former biggest client. Nathan's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His mind was reeling. The Golden Palace had been his top account for years until they abruptly pulled out of negotiations last month. Now he knew why. They had wanted Alina instead. And she had turned them down. A low whistle came from Henry Kaufman, one of Nathan's potential investors. "That's impressive," he said, rubbing his chin. He glanced at Nathan, then back at Alina. "Why didn't you take it?" he asked. Alina smiled, but there was a steeliness behind it. "Because I believed in my marriage," she said, never taking her eyes off Nathan. "I thought my husband would be proud of me." Another awkward silence. Nathan's investors exchanged glances. Then one of them slid his business card toward Alina. "Actually," he said, adjusting his tie, "I've been looking for a catering company for my firm's monthly events. Would you be open to a conversation?" Nathan's jaw tightened painfully. It was happening, right in front of him. The people who had once put their faith in him were now turning toward his wife instead. Another investor, a corporate events planner, raised a hand. "We've actually been wanting to introduce more diverse cuisine into our functions. If you're available, Mrs. Collins, I'd love to talk business." Nathan felt sick. This wasn't just Alina proving her success. This was her stealing his spotlight. And the worst part, she wasn't even trying to. As the weight of his own downfall settled on Nathan's shoulders, Chef Louis Bernard stepped forward once more. He had been quietly watching the exchange, his sharp eyes flicking between Alina's steady confidence and Nathan's spiraling disbelief. And then, with a small nod of approval, he spoke. "Alina," he said, ignoring Nathan entirely, "would you consider collaborating with us?" The restaurant fell silent again. Nathan's head snapped toward the chef, his face twisted in disbelief. "What?" he blurted out. Chef Louis didn't even look at him. His eyes were on Alina, warm with respect. "2 nights a week," he continued. "I'd like you to use this restaurant to teach and showcase Filipino cuisine. A cooking class, perhaps, or a tasting menu. I think our guests would be quite intrigued." A hush spread through the room. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, listening intently. Alina felt her chest tighten with emotion. This was everything she had dreamed of. Recognition. A platform. A chance to share her culture and food with the world. And right there, standing in front of the man who had spent years belittling her dreams, she made her choice. She straightened her spine. And she said the one thing that would destroy Nathan completely. "I'd love to." The moment the words left her lips, the restaurant erupted into applause. Not polite, reserved claps, but real, enthusiastic applause. People stood from their seats, smiling, murmuring their approval. Diners leaned toward each other, already talking about returning to try her food. Nathan, however, was completely silent. He just stood there, shoulders tense, fists clenched, watching as his wife, the woman he had tried so hard to suppress, was now being celebrated in front of everyone. As the applause settled, Chef Louis extended his hand. Alina took it firmly, sealing the deal. And as she did, she finally understood. She had spent years waiting for Nathan's approval. Tonight, she realized she never needed it. Nathan Collins might have lost his investors. He might have lost his business contacts. But most of all, he had lost the woman he had never truly valued. And the worst part, there was no one to blame but himself. Nathan Collins had always lived in control. He controlled the way people saw him, the way they spoke about him, the way his business was presented to the world. And for 5 years, he had controlled Alina's voice. By dismissing her work, by making her feel small, by convincing her that her success was just a hobby. But tonight he had lost control completely. The applause still echoed in La Lumiere, a soft hum of approval that Nathan couldn't drown out no matter how much he wished he could. Alina stood at the center of it all, glowing, radiant, completely untouched by his humiliation attempt. For the first time, he truly saw her, not as his wife, not as someone beneath him, but as a woman who no longer needed him at all. The realization hit him like a freight train. His business was falling apart. His investors had walked away. And now, his wife, the woman who had once looked at him with admiration, was standing shoulder to shoulder with San Francisco's most respected chef. Nathan swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to move. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out hesitantly. "Elena," he said. His voice was softer now, less sure of itself than ever before. "Can we talk?" Elena turned to him. And in that moment, Nathan saw the difference. She wasn't the same woman who used to wait for his approval. She wasn't the same woman who let him make her feel small. She was done shrinking for him. Elena's dark eyes held his for a long moment. Then she smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile she used to give him. It wasn't soft, it wasn't longing, it was final. "For years," she said, her voice steady, "I made myself small so you could feel bigger." Nathan's breath hitched. She took a step back. "I'm done with that." And then, without another word, she turned away. She walked toward the kitchen, her place, the place where she had always belonged, and she didn't look back. The doors swung open, and with that single step, she left behind everything she had once held back for him. Nathan stood there, watching her disappear, and for the first time in his life, he understood what true regret felt like. As the kitchen doors swung shut behind her, the restaurant burst into celebration. Customers lined up, eager to sign up for her new cooking classes. Waiters chatted excitedly about the upcoming Filipino tasting nights. Diners who had never even tasted Filipino food before were already planning their next visit. Chef Louis Bernard shook her hand in the back of the kitchen, nodding approvingly. "You were always meant for this, Madame Elena," he said. And for the first time in a long time, Elena truly believed it. By the end of the night, as the last guests left and the kitchen quieted, Nathan Collins was nowhere to be seen. But on table 9, sitting beneath an empty wine glass, was a check. The amount. Exactly what Elena had invested to start her catering business. He had never helped her before, never believed in her before. But tonight, he finally acknowledged her worth. Elena stared at the check for a moment. Then, without hesitation, she folded it in half and tucked it away. Not because she needed it, but because she had already won. As she stepped outside, the night air felt different, lighter, full of possibilities. For years she had waited for Nathan to respect her. Waited for his validation. Waited for the right moment to step into her own power. But she wasn't waiting anymore. Tonight, she had done something far greater than proving herself to her husband. She had taken back her voice, and in doing so, she had opened the door for others. For every woman, every dreamer, every person who had ever been told their passion wasn't good enough. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of something much bigger.